Hello, everyone. Happy Monday. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Sarah Siegel, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Emma Brown, discussing her book, To Raise a Boy: Classrooms, Locker Rooms, Bedrooms, and the Hidden Struggles of American Boyhood. She is joined in conversation tonight by Soraya Chemaly. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we're hosting events here on Zoom, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk today, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you'd like to buy a copy of To Raise a Boy, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase it. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you for your support of community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link to donate in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. Now, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Emma Brown is an investigative reporter at the Washington Post. In her life before journalism, she worked as a wilderness ranger in Wyoming and a middle school math teacher in Alaska. She lives with her husband and 2 children in Washington, D.C. She is joined tonight by Soraya Chemaly, an award-winning writer and activist whose work focuses on the role of gender in culture, politics, religion, and media. She is the director of the Women's Media Center Speech Project, which aims to curb online abuse, increase media and tech diversity, and expand women's freedom of expression. After occupying various leadership positions in corporate marketing and founding her own consulting firm, she returned to her writing and advocacy work full-time. Her articles appear frequently in Time, The Guardian, The Nation, HuffPost, and The Atlantic. Today they are discussing To Raise a Boy: Classrooms, Locker Rooms, Bedrooms, and the Hidden Struggles of American Boyhood. The question, how will I raise my son to be different, gripped Washington Post investigative reporter Emma Brown, who was at home nursing her 6-week-old son when the hashtag #MeToo movement erupted. In search of an answer, Brown traveled around the country through towns urban and rural, affluent and distressed. In the course of her reporting, she interviewed hundreds of people, educators, parents, coaches, researchers, men and boys, to understand the challenges boys face and how to address them. To Raise a Boy combines assiduous reporting, cutting-edge scientific research, and boys' powerful testimonials to expose the crisis in young men's emotional and physical health. Emma Brown connects the dots between educators, researchers, policymakers, and mental health professionals in this tour de force that upends everything we thought we knew about boys. Without further ado, I will turn things over to our speakers. Emma, Soraya, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to start the evening with Emma, who is going to start with a reading. So after that, we'll have a conversation and then welcome your questions and look forward to the discussion towards the end of our hour. Emma?
Thank you, Soraya. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everybody who's here tonight. So appreciate you spending this time with us. As Sarah explained, this book started when my son, Gus, was 6 weeks old and I was home nursing him, and the Me Too movement exploded and really, forced me to start thinking about something I somehow had not thought about before, which was, how was I going to raise this boy? And how was I going to raise him to be a kind and empathetic person with the skills he needed to have strong relationships, not just with girls and women, but with other boys and men and with himself. And so I'm going to read just a bit from the beginning of the book about this realization that I just had never really thought about what it's like to be a boy. I'm embarrassed to admit that I had never given much thought to how boys learn to be boys until that moment in late 2017, sitting at home with my chubby, cooing infant son, reading about the wrongdoings of men. These men had been infants once too, and then they had grown up. For me, raising a boy feels a little like traveling in a foreign land. It was different with my daughter. When I gave birth to her 3 years before my son was born, I had no idea how to be a mother. But after decades of navigating life as a woman, I knew unequivocally what I wanted for her. My husband and I named her Juniper after the hardy trees that cling to the sides of mountains. I wanted her to see herself as capable of anything, constrained by none of the old limits on who women must be and how they must move through the world. She could play with trucks and dolls. She could wear dresses and overalls. She could be an astronaut or a nurse. She could be fierce and funny and loving and steely spined. I am strong and fearless, I taught her to say when she was 2, as she hesitated on the playground, her lips quivering as she considered crossing a rope netting bridge strung 10 feet off the ground. I took her hand and helped her across, nudging her along with that mantra, which she repeated as we inched forward. There was nothing premeditated about that little sentence. It just appeared on my tongue, distilling what I wanted her to be and how I hoped she would think of herself. When we reached the far end, she threw her arms in the air and crowed, "I am strong and fearless." I had no such pithy motto for my son, August. Reminding a boy to be strong and fearless seemed unnecessary, maybe even counterproductive, fortifying a stereotype instead of unraveling it. What could I give him to help him ignore the tired old expectations of boys, to understand the limitlessness of his life's possibilities in the same way I had wanted Juniper to see the limitlessness of hers? I had no idea. I didn't know how to help him resist the stresses and stereotypes of boyhood because I had never grappled with the fact that boys face stresses and stereotypes at all. And so that was what launched me on this journey to talk to people all over the country, coaches and teachers and scholars and boys and their parents about what it's like to be a boy in America. So I could understand this world that my son and all boys are growing up in. And I guess, the shocking thing for me was I think I thought girls had it much harder than boys. That was my bias going into this, having grown up as a girl and been subjected to the pressures that our girls, receive from the time they're tiny. And it was really eye-opening for me to realize and come to understand the kinds of pressures and messages that are aimed at boys from the time they're tiny, and the kind of impact that those messages can have. And what we need to do better to help boys resist and challenge those messages that get sent to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I was really struck throughout your book by the sort of constant acknowledgement, which sounds silly to say, but that boys have emotional sensitivity and that they have emotional need, and how that flies in the face of expectations about them and their inner lives and their relationships. And ultimately, I think, and this is a question I have for you, how do you see that relating to power, right? Because we talk a lot about stereotypes and the fact that boys and girls face different problems, but there are power disparities that I think that social construction around their identities is meant to support. How did you weave that aspect of recognizing power into your thinking as you wrote?
Wow. Well, power is strung through so many of the issues that I wrote about in this book. It has to do with how we talk, the failures and how we talk about consent is a lot of our failures to talk about power, for example. But, I think I want to go back to something you were saying about boys' emotional lives. And, the therapist and author Terry Real described it to me when I interviewed him as, we ask boys to have themselves, as in cut themselves in half, right? And we ask them to bury the parts of themselves that we call girly, because speaking of power, what boy wants to be girly? Girly is less powerful. Girly is not what you want to be. And so those messages that boys get, then they don't just bury the parts of themselves that like pink, for example, or sparkly dresses. They bury the parts of themselves that connecting and human emotion, because we associate those things with the feminine in our culture. And so I think, the long-term impacts of that for our boys is difficulty sustaining friendships over time. It is physical health. We know that boys who really adhere to those rigid ideas about masculinity, research indicates to us that they have more physical health problems later on, and then mental health problems. And suicide rates for men are nearly 4 times the rate as women in this country. And so, when we are thinking about what do we need to do differently and better for boys, this is like really at the top of the list. Is helping boys see that they get to have access to the whole spectrum of humanity.
I wrote a book about women in anger, girls in anger, and I sometimes joke that I could write the exact same book and just flip the genders in a binary way and have it be about sadness and fear for men. Because that bifurcation in emotions, the way we distribute them in this very rigid binary way, it is really dehumanizing to kids. So I want to jump in. The theme, as you articulated with your reading, that drove you, I think you have this in your introduction too, is just this prevalent violence, sexual violence, and how it captures, I think, so much of this, the emotional disregard for themselves and for the people that they're with, the violence, the power, the control, all of the aspects of a kind of really gender distributions of how we manage relationships. And I think a lot of people are still really surprised by the fact that boys are so vulnerable to sexual assault as children. And they do age out of it. Girls and women don't age out of it. But in childhood, boys are really vulnerable as well. And yet all our myths around sexual violence and assault really put them at heightened risk because we're overly concerned, I think, and more rigid with safety rules for girls. And we leave boys, often in the service of fraternity, at the mercy of coaches and leaders and charismatic leaders in their communities. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you learned and what may have been surprising to you about all of that childhood vulnerability?
Absolutely. I mean, the first chapter in the book is about the sexual victimization of boys, and I started there because this, more than anything, was just profoundly disturbing and transformative for me as I thought about what does it mean to be a boy, and how do we think about boys in our country and in our culture. As you said, there's an astonishingly high number of boys who experience some kind of sexual victimization as children. It's as many as 1 in 6 before they reach 18. And sometimes it's what our minds jump immediately to Catholic Church or Boy Scouts of America, older men preying on younger boys. Mm-hmm. I wrote in some more depth about peers preying on one another, and in particular, sort of sexualized attacks in the context of sports, which is sometimes called hazing, but I think is better called by what it is, which is sexual assault or rape in some cases. And so one of the stories that stands out is this boy who was a middle school student. He had just moved to a new school in Oklahoma. He was nervous as middle school. It's hard to go to a new school. And in front of the entire music class, when the teacher was out of the room, a couple boys from his football team sexually assaulted him in front of everybody. And he went to tell the principal, and it later came out because there was an investigation, a civil case, that the principal later told investigators, had the same thing happened to a girl, I would have seen it as sexual assault, but because it was a boy, I thought it was horseplay. Yeah. And why does that matter? Why does it matter what we call it? Well, it matters because of the support boys do or do not get in the aftermath of something like that. And it matters because what we're really saying is we don't really think boys feel the same way or can feel pain as deeply as girls. And it's just not true. I mean, and it is a really pernicious flip side of thinking that it's a flip side of thinking like girls are only feel or girls are hysterical or something, right? So, so I think, we have made this a more hidden problem because boys don't learn that they can be sexually assaulted. Boys don't learn, in more sort of sexual or romantic contexts where they feel pressured to have sex they don't want. They don't learn to think about that as a sexual assault. They learn to think, oh, I'm a guy. Of
Right.
course I want to have sex, right? So there's so many ways we tell boys that their bodies are not quite their own. And I think we've got to tell young boys that their bodies are their own, that their bodies are sacred. And that, I think that in doing that, hopefully, we can teach boys the kind of respect. If we give them the respect that we want
Right.
from them, then perhaps it won't be so jarring to them to be told on the one hand that to respect all bodies, but then to see their own bodies sort of disrespected.
How did you, I mean, you did lots of really wonderful interviews and spoke to many experts. And, when you describe that dynamic, one of the things that I've learned writing about these issues is a profound discomfort that adults, particularly administrators, parents, counselors have with talking about inequality to students, to young students, because they really don't want to tell kids that some people are less equal than other people, and that kind of social dynamic is relevant to them, because in this country we're all equal all the time, right? And when you describe the scene that you just did, one thing that's really striking to me is that sexually assaulting a boy that way in a quote unquote hazing incident is a gendered expression of physical power, right? It is a masculine right and entitlement and power to do this to someone who's weaker and more vulnerable and feminized by virtue of being penetrated, right? And so did you come across anybody in an authoritative capacity with authority who had a language to talk to students about what that meant? Because it's not just that we don't teach boys that they are vulnerable to sexual assault or that their bodies are their own. We are simultaneously also teaching them that they have the right to act as masculine people in physically, sexually dominating ways.
I did not. I mean, in fact, I spoke to a psychologist who studies this kind of quote unquote hazing, sexualized hazing. And she says that hazing education in terms of adults in schools and adults on teams, understanding what's happening is and teaching young people in their lives is in the dark ages, she said. And it's not something that that adults are talking to young people about, I don't think.
Right.
And at the same time, there's no good data on this kind of attack. And that's because it's so hard for researchers to ask young people about anything having to do with sex or sexual violence. So we don't know how often this happens, and yet the folks who study it believe that it's happening more often. And so, these are boys, the boys to whom this happens when they're freshmen, then grow older and they believe that that's normal. That's how you that's how you show your power. That's how you build cohesion on a team. Like they come to believe that's normal. And if nobody's telling them different,
right,
then that's our fault as adults, right? That they think that that's normal. And I think that can be said for lots of things beyond just this particular kind of violence. There's a lot of violence that kids see in their schools and in their communities that they come to see as normal if nobody is telling them otherwise or intervening.
Mm-hmm. So let's go from that environment to, I'm going to put two chapters together, but the necessity for really good social and emotionally, and I would argue also trauma-informed sex ed, which I don't even think of as sex ed. It's really so much more than that in terms of how we want children to learn to think of themselves and their relationships. But can you talk about why that's so critically important and why it's important starting from the very beginning, to be teaching kids from kindergarten on in age-appropriate ways, so that you prevent these situations in the first place.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm going to start just by telling you something that shocked me. I was a middle school teacher before I became a reporter. Then I spent most of my life as a journalist covering education. And I had no real grasp of the fact that sex education has actually evaporated from public schools over the past 2 decades. That was news to me. I knew there wasn't a lot of it, but I did not know that it was actually declining, and not just sort of things that you might think of as controversial social topics, but puberty, for example, is
Right.
being taught less of it. So we just aren't making room in our schools to teach kids about this really fundamental part of life. So what, and then there's other research showing that parents aren't also, many parents aren't talking to their kids about sexuality or about even just what it means to have a respectful sexual or romantic relationship. So we've left this vacuum where it's filled for many boys by online pornography. And one boy told me he's actually a young man or a boy in Boston high school when I met him. And he told me he had been watching pornography since he was in 5th grade at the suggestion of his friends. And he just seeing the images that he saw, grew up believing if you want sex, you just get it, you just have it, you don't ask. And that's the danger of leaving that vacuum for boys, is that they come to learn from all of the media around us, but in particular pornography, about that sex doesn't have to be consensual or respectful, that sex can be and often is degrading and violent to women. And the problems with that are obvious.
Right.
And the research shows us that particularly violent pornography is correlated with then acting aggressively in sex.
Right.
So, we've got to do better and talk with young people about sex and sexuality, so it's not something they're taking guidance from these images on their screens.
Mm-hmm.
And why do we need to start early? Well, I think, as you said, it's not just about sex and sexuality. It's a comprehensive version of sex ed is about talking about, personal boundaries, which is something that you can talk about from a very young age and don't have to talk about sex at all. But it's also all of the ideas we have about gender and sex, and and helping young people see that those are just scripts. They're just ideas they're myths that we come to learn. And that then if we don't realize they're myths, can really affect how we interact with one another. For example, the script that girls act coy and like they don't really want to have sex, so they will say no matter what. You just have to push past that to get to the yes. That is something that people learn and believe, both boys and girls. And you can see why that's so dangerous, because then when a boy hears no, or a girl seems uncomfortable, he just thinks, well, that's just how girls are. And so I just have to keep going and do what boys do, which is just power through. So, we can start by sort of helping deconstruct some of these myths about what boys do and what girls do also early, before we're talking about sex. When we're talking about, I do it with my 3-year-old, thinks that boys always have short hair and girls always have long hair. And we spend plenty of time talking about how that's not true. And I sort of see that as the beginning of a very long and ongoing conversation about dispelling myths about what boys and girls must always do.
Yeah, I think, in my experience, and also I think a lot of research is showing this, in some ways we've really reinscribed very rigid gender norms in a period of backlash for about 25 years. Toys, games, children's marketing, segmentation, mass segmentation of products in those ways resulted in hyper-gendered programming for kids, superheroes and pink Legos. And, it's extremely harmful to identity and social relationships when those seem like immovable forces, and at the same time, we have a generation, I think, that is much more comfortable as individuals with fluidity in gender and gender identity and sexuality, but so far not old enough to have hit the wall of child rearing and institutions that are very rigid. which is why I think the schools, as you say, we've been failing in our schools to make those differences. I want to shift to another chapter. You talk about, and I think this is clearly related, because it's not just about sex or bodies, it's about emotional health and relationships and boundaries. And I will say too, I think it's related to not talking about inequality with kids. You have an excellent chapter on race, racism, violence, and trauma. Can you talk about that? How you came to write what you wrote as you were researching?
Sure. Yeah. So this is a chapter that is mostly set in Chicago, where I traveled to. I heard about a program that called Becoming a Man. It's for middle and high school boys in Chicago, and as an education reporter, you read about all kinds of sort of programs or efforts to make things better for kids on any number of fronts. And this one just had such astonishing results in terms of reducing a child's likelihood of being arrested for violent behavior, and in terms of increasing graduation rates. And I thought, I've got to go see what this is, because it was all about, it's 4 boys, and it's sitting in a circle and being real with each other. And so what boys told me in this when I went to go visit this middle school, they told me that what was so powerful for them was being able to be real and drop their masks with one another and with their counselor, and having a place where they could be safe to do that. They also, they were much more animated in talking, though less, much more animated in talking about the impact of race on their lives than the impact of gender, which is understandable, because I think it was just so clear to them, the impact of race on their lives. And they talked about the way the world saw them. They talked about the lack of resources that they had compared to white kids in the suburbs. Most of these boys in this particular room were Black. Yeah. And they just, they talked about being seen as predators. And one of them brought up Emmett Till, and he said, that's still how people see us. And I guess it was just, so just incredibly disturbing and sad to know that boys in 2000, that was 2019 when I was in Chicago, were growing up understanding how the world saw them in that way. And the research bears that out in terms of how the world sees young Black boys. There's research showing, for example, that Black boys are more likely to, let's go all the way back to preschool. They are like 3.5 times more likely to be suspended in preschool. Right. And there's research showing that where you put teachers in front of a video and you tell them to look for the kid who's making trouble, and they look at the Black boy in the screen instead of the white girl or whatever, so that they pick up on those messages starting so young. And then older boys who I spoke to, who are older Black boys, that message that they are seen as predators, they carry that, so that when they're in high school and in college, they're telling me, I have to be extra careful. I think all boys that I talked to for this book are feeling they know that they are living in an age of more accountability for sexual assault and sexual harassment than previous generations, and they feel some pressure from that. But the Black boys I interviewed in particular said, I can't, there's no room for error for me. Right.
Well, I think it's interesting, because I think that you're describing young Black boys with an acute sense of how racism is affecting them. And I'm wondering if you think circles of white boys could likewise discuss the impact of race on their lives. And whether that, we've focused to the extent that we have on intersectionality on girls often, and on Black girls in particular, for all known reasons. But I think that it's very hard for boys, particularly white boys, to think of their gender, male as a gender, and race, white, as a race. in America. I think that's doubly hard. And I'm wondering if you had any conversations with boys about that topic.
I did, and it varied dramatically depending on the boy and the community that he was growing up in. And
Yeah.
so there were some white boys who I spoke to who felt targeted because they were white boys. They felt like the world, it was not a safe place for them as white boys. And then there were other white boys I spoke to who saw their whiteness very differently and talked about their whiteness very differently. And so I think, as with so many things in our country, the way that boys think about their gender or think about their racial identities is just really polarized. And boys are sort of, in many ways, growing up in different countries, almost depending on where they are and what their community is.
I think that's right. I'm going to break here just to let everybody know. I see there's a note here, but in about 10 minutes, we're going to open up for questions. So please don't wait, like put your questions in there now. I wanted to talk about single-sex education. You have a chapter, and this is a really hard topic because we live in such a sex-segregated world without even realizing it. Like, our labor is segregated, our care is segregated, our leadership is segregated. Tell me about your discussions regarding education and how these schools are trying to stay, as you say, relevant.
Yeah, I think schools, especially particularly in the aftermath of the Kavanaugh hearings and all the focus on his single-sex high school, what is the culture of these places? When I started my research for this book, I think all boys schools were in a real moment of trying to figure out, how do we stay relevant? And there's been a lot of research done on academic outcomes and career outcomes for single-sex schools, and far less for social outcomes and relationship outcomes. So there's not a lot of great data on that. Young men I talked to who had graduated from all boys schools told me that they loved their experiences, many of them, but when they left, they felt like they had a deficit because they hadn't had an opportunity to interact with girls outside of parties and dances. And they said, I didn't. One young man said, I didn't know how to be around women. And so a lot of schools are trying to figure out, how do we be an all boys school and yet have more girls interacting with our boys during the day outside of those sort of charged environments. And that could beg the question, well, why, if you're trying to be an all boys school and bring more girls in, like, do you need to be an all boys school? But the argument, so I think all girls schools have long sort of sold themselves as, like, this is a place where girls can be themselves and can be empowered to have roles that maybe in co-ed schools would be reserved for boys more often. And boys schools make much the same pitch. They say that we are a place where boys can be fully themselves. They can sing in the choir and be on the football team. They can deeply connect with one another. And I think what I learned is that if a boys school is not really intentionally thinking about what it means to be a boys school and what it means to have a space where there are no girls and usually not very many women faculty, then that is a school that is not considering sort of all of the ramifications of that kind of space. But I visited a school that was really trying to think hard about this, because they had just been, two of their football players, it's a renowned football program, two of their football players in 2 consecutive years were convicted of rape. And they were sort of the school leadership was sort of set on their heels, shocked. So, what do we do? And so they were taking this on in what I thought was, a really, they were really trying. And it was too soon to know when I visited whether that was really going to take hold, whether their efforts to talk to boys about masculinity and gender norms and sexual violence were going to take hold. But I admired them for trying.
So I may seem fixated, but I've spent a lot of time talking to educators and thinking and writing about single-sex schools. And I think one of the persistent themes too is that boys' schools, they are not interested in talking about the overt power that they're exercising when they are educating boys to be leaders, for example. And it's hard. I think it's a really huge culture shift to, as a matter of fact, to shift to a culture that would lead to a lot of introspection about institutions and about gender. And I'm wondering, when I was doing my research into emotions and anger, basically concluded that we should be trying to talk to kids about emotional competence. We teach them emotions, as you say, by gender, which is debilitating to them as individuals and to relationships and to society. But it's very clear from the little research that exists that non-binary androgynous people have healthier emotional regulation and greater life satisfaction very often, which is separate, for example, from thinking about high rates of suicide for trans kids, which is a huge issue. But I'm wondering if in your single-sex education work, any of those topics came up about the institutional commitment to gender binaries in a world in which there is a lot of dissolution of those binaries.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, where it came up in my conversations was with young men who had been through single-sex schools, went off to college and into the workplace, and then felt like that was not the real world that I was living in, you know, that I was being taught in, and a lot of questioning from those young men.
Mhm.
As for the institutions themselves, I don't know. They define themselves right now as all boys schools, and I think, one of the young men I interviewed went to a Canadian all boys school, and he wrote me after the book came out and said he had become more firm in his belief that the school should go co-ed, but it's designate, its culture, its whole being is built around
Right.
being an all boys school. But so I don't know. I didn't hear a lot of
Yeah.
questioning of that from folks who are in schools now and leading
Okay.
schools now.
All right. So I want to get to questions because we do have several that are related to this. Just I'm going to quickly read these. Let me see. Way too often, this is from Thomas Wiener, way too often friendships, this is to build on what you were saying, are segregated. So while I get the need for all girls and all women's schools, I worked at Smith College's lab school, I'm concerned about the friendship gap. This question is, do all boys schools serve a healthy purpose? And I think you've been addressing that. But maybe if you can talk, we didn't have a chance to talk about loneliness and friendships, which is another chapter in your book. So maybe you can talk about loneliness, friendships, friendship formation, and desegregating those relationships.
Sure. So I think, let me just say quickly about the all boys schools that the thing they love most is these retreats that they went on. This was at multiple schools. They talked about
Yeah.
being on retreats and being able to be so intimate with one another, basically. They love, I mean, that was magic to them. And I asked them, well, could you do that if there were girls around? Like, wouldn't that be something if you could drop your mask with girls around? And they were like, that was, some of them that was really exciting, and some of them that was really scary. But I think that this notion that boys really crave that intimacy is what the research shows us. It shows us that, and I'm thinking here of a psychology researcher at NYU who has tracked boys. She tracks cohorts of boys over a matter of years, interviewing them about their friendships, and finds that they crave intimate, close relationships just as much as girls do, and they have those relationships when they're young. And then in mid-adolescence, those relationships sort of drift away.
Yeah.
And they don't know how, or don't have the opportunities to, or for whatever reason, they don't rebuild them. or get new ones. And so then they're sort of left adrift. And it is at that time in sort of mid-adolescence when the suicide rate among boys really skyrockets up, over and above the suicide rate among girls.
Yeah.
And that's not causation, that's a correlation, but it is stunning. And one of the most poignant parts of my research was meeting this 50-year-old man at a men's group in downtown DC who said, he had woken up and he was at the men's group because he had woken up in middle age and realized he really felt alone. He didn't have close friends to share his life with, and to share his emotions and fears and anxieties and all the things that we share with friends.
Yes.
And we know that loneliness is toxic. Loneliness has real, it is hard on your health, your mental and your physical health. And so, yeah, I think when I think about my son, I think, I want him to have role models of male friendship. I want him to have role models in his parents as to what it feels like to have a close, emotionally intimate relationship with us, because, we want our boys to grow up and know that part of having a full life. So I think, in terms of the segregated part of it, I really do. I mean, my dream for my son would be that he would be able to be his real self and have those kinds of intimate connections with boys and with girls, and to know that kind of friendship is possible and a part of a really rich life.
Did you encounter people who were talking to boys? Well, I mean, I think part of what you're describing is that so many men learn to use women, frankly, as emotional prosthetics. They manage all the relationships around them. They soften them. They manage social engagements and schools and volunteering. And so by the time men hit middle age, if they have been particularly in a heterosexual family environment, the distribution of labor has often meant that is gendered. And so I'm wondering if, I'm probably not even asking you a question because I know the answer to this, it's just not happening, but that quality of emotional labor, right? We're in this pandemic, we know people are locked at home, and we're modeling behavior for kids, and we're modeling behavior in which 2 million women have had to go home out of the workforce, and kids are watching that, right? One of the questions here that is related to what I'm saying is, do you have any suggestions for parents? And I'm going to refine that by saying, do you have any suggestions for parents in this particular moment when everyone is at home and we're kind of seeing, for lack of a better term, a concentrated version of patriarchal family units as saving the family, right? Where this exchange of labor, of time, and care is happening and kids are watching.
Yeah, I have to preface this by saying I'm not a parenting expert, and I didn't write this book as like a parenting guide, because that's just not who I am. I really wrote it to explore this world that our sons or our nephews or the boys in our lives are growing up in, and what not only parents are, a sort of how parents have parented and what that has meant for boys, but also all of the systems and structures that are around us, all the institutions that help raise our boys, and wanted to understand what those institutions could also do better or differently in order to help create different outcomes. So I just want to preface it that way. And of course, I learned as a parent myself what I want to do differently. I mean, I think one of the key things you're pointing out is that children learn, they learn from the role models that are around them. And there's research showing that when fathers, in a heterosexual couple, when fathers are involved in the care of their child, of their son, then that son is involved in housework, and involved in those sort of women's work of taking care of the family, then the son grows up with a different kind of vision than the son who grows up with a very sort of traditionally divided couple. And what I mean by that is he grows up more likely to think about his own future marriage as a more egalitarian one. and more likely to think about a wider range of careers. So how we divide labor and how
Right.
we live in our homes does have a really big impact on what children imagine for themselves.
Yeah.
So in the pandemic, I mean, the really tough thing I think about what's happened in the workforce, and this is me reading other people's reporting now, but is that it comes down to an economic choice that you have to make, and if somebody, or it comes down to one person losing their job and the other person having to take on more hours, and a lot of times because of the way the world is, that means the mom leaves the workforce and the
Right.
dad works more, right? And so I
He
think what's
works more.
really tough about that is it feels like it doesn't feel like a choice always that people are making.
Right. I'll be a niggler and say that the, the men work for pay in that situation, whereas the women are doing the unpaid work, which is, I think, the problem of modeling this labor. With so many people don't have the choice; they really have to do this, and it's a necessity. So we have a few more minutes. Krista has a good question. How does social class come into play in terms of how boyhood is experienced differentially across these institutions? Can you talk a little bit about how I think in every one of these chapters, clearly that's relevant.
Absolutely. And I think, social class and race and community, the kind of community you're in, all these things weave together. And so, as I said before, I think our boys are in some ways growing up in different countries. I was in Berkeley at an all-boys school, middle school in Berkeley, that is, sort of dedicated to having boys interrogate their masculinity and love their masculinity, which I should have mentioned before when you asked me about sort of schools that are thinking a little more outside the box. But anyway, boys there are encouraged to be whoever they are. One boy said to me, that saying, boys will be boys. Well, that means boys can be creative, boys can be compassionate. We are not held back by social stereotypes. So that was one 12-year-old's experience growing up in Berkeley. And then I talked to a young man who had grown up in a rural town in Kentucky, where he learned, he learned very traditional rules about what it means to be a boy. He learned, above all, you may not be gay. And he told me about sort of saying, making anti-gay slurs and sort of acting out this hatred towards gay people when he in fact himself was gay and came out later. And so like the world boys are growing up in, and this is class, but it is also the politics of the community you're in and race and all the other things. It just varies so widely that it's not sort of, I think that a lot of the pressures boys face can be similar, but how those actually play out in their lives depends so much on the context that they're in.
We haven't really talked about this. There's a question here from Sabrina about what the impact that straight men have, and what responsibility they may feel for raising boys differently today. And so I'm wondering how you found that sexual identity in parenting, if you found anything, and if yes or no. We've talked about sort of hetero norms, which are powerful, even in same-sex relationships, actually. But what did you find in terms of modeling behavior for boys in different scenarios from that perspective?
What I found was that fathers, I think, in particular, that there often is a link for fathers when they're thinking about raising their sons, between whether my son is going to be masculine enough and whether my son is going to be straight. Meaning there's like this linking of masculinity and sexual orientation.
Yes.
And that sometimes it happens for fathers because they're trying to protect their sons. They don't want their sons to act gay because they don't want their sons to be beat up. or otherwise, teased or put in harm's way. And so I think that is a really powerful sort of a really powerful thing that a lot of fathers deal with. I mean, one man I talked to who lives in Los Angeles now talked about growing up in Chicago in the 80s at a time when you would be beat up if someone thought you were gay. And his son, his 8-year-old wanted, they were at the mall and he saw an American Doll shop and wanted a doll. And his father was like, I really believe that my son should be able to play with a doll. And yet also I really want to protect him from a world that's going to destroy him if he plays with a doll. And so I think that kind of tension is something that a lot of fathers feel.
Right. It's interesting because I've talked to a lot of those fathers, and if you say to them, at its core, that's misogyny and we should be teaching feminism, they balk very often at that, because feminism is interpreted as pathologizing boyhood in some way, or hurting boys, or trying to get them to be less masculine. And so actually, I'm going to ask you a question that you and I talked about before, which is this phrase toxic masculinity, which I think causes people to seize up sometimes and say, oh my God, all masculinity isn't toxic. Can you talk about your choice not to use that word and how it evolved?
Yeah, I didn't use the word in the book, and in fact wrote, I think we should consider laying off the term, because when I talk to boys, they told me, like, we shut down when we hear that. And not all boys, but quite a few. And one boy in St. Louis in particular, who himself had he didn't have any qualms with the term, but he said, if you use that term, nobody's going to listen to the next thing you say. And it just seemed to me like, if we want boys to be part of this conversation and invite them into thinking about how to broaden ideas about masculinity, it helps to use words that they're willing to hear and willing to embrace. So, I talk about pressures boys face, or the man box, which is a term that feminist men have used for a long time, and talking about these restrictions that boys and men face. But so the notion of sort of just creating a place where the people we most want to reach with the support that we're talking about feel like they're comfortable in the conversation. I don't think that's sort of glossing over. I don't know. I don't think that's like giving anything up. I think it's sort of trying to honor and respect boys and their where they are.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I think that's probably, I'm just looking through the questions. There are a couple of questions about programs aimed at educating boys. And I don't know if you just want to talk broadly about that and talk about what you talk about in the book, just to give potential readers and readers a quick snapshot, because I know you can't list all the programs.
Yeah, I'll say, thank you to whoever asked that question, because there is a lot of hard stuff in this book. But I conclude with so much hope. Like, I finished this book myself, working on it with so much hope and so much gratitude that it is now that I'm raising my son, and not a generation ago or even half a generation ago, because I do think that the Me Too movement has played a big part in kind of forcing us to think, not forcing people across the country to think more deeply about how boys are raised, and to create more space for them to access their full humanity, and also hopefully give them more guidance on issues of consent and healthy relationships. So, and there are a ton of people and organizations who are working on related issues, but I'll just talk about a couple. One is, when we talk about for example, sexual victimization on sports teams, or just sports teams in general, and the kind of cultures that can be on them. There's an incredible program called Coaching Boys into Men, where coaches use their power that they have over their players. They harness that power for good, to talk with them 15 minutes a week about respect, about consent, about dignity. And it's literally just 15 minutes a week. Yet there's gold-plated research showing that it makes a difference. Boys who go through it less likely to commit dating violence, less likely to stand by or laugh when they see someone else acting abusively. And so, and boys, one of the boys that I talked to who went through it told me he had actually gone to his coach and said, I'm sick of the misogynistic language in the locker room. I am sick of being asked to talk about, the sex my girlfriend and I are having, like, help me. And his coach, to his credit, did help him. This is how he helped him. And this boy told me it made a huge difference, not just in the way boys talked about girls in the locker room, but in just the way they dealt with one another, because it opened up a little space in their lives where they were talking in a really real way about something that really mattered to all of them, which is their relationships. So that's just one example. I had one other one. This is little kids. This is a 4th grade class I was in, where the teachers, social emotional learning is one of those buzzwords. It can be done really poorly in schools. It can also be done really powerfully. And this particular school in Washington, D.C., Maury Elementary School, just 2 really incredible 4th grade teachers who have turned social emotional learning into sort of the center of what they do. And so, these children, when you walk in, they can tell you all about how they deal with their emotions. They have learned so many skills and so much language for talking about how they solve problems, interpersonal, intrapersonal problems. One little boy, he was so upset about something, and he walked outside. He left the classroom, came back in a few minutes later, and he gave his teacher a hug, and he told her he had breathed. And then he talked to me, and he explained to me he had learned how to deal with his anger. He learned how to manage his emotions in this class. So he had gone outside, and he had taken a few minutes, and he had breathed, and then he had talked to a friend, and he was then back in his classroom ready to learn. And his teacher told me, before, at the beginning of the year, he would have thrown things. So that is not a program aimed at boys, but it is a program that boys really, not a program, it's just an incredible couple of teachers who really dedicate themselves to this, and it makes a huge difference for boys.
Well, I think we're going to close here. I want to thank everyone who participated and attended tonight, and thanks to Harvard Bookstore for hosting this and for inviting me to do this with Emma. It really is a wonderful book. Thank you for writing it. I'm going to let you have the final word and tell people where to find you, and close the event.
Oh, well, thank you, Soraya. Thank you so much to Harvard Bookstore as well, and to all of you. I have a website called toraiseaboy.com and a Twitter handle, Emmers Brown, and I am there and would love to see you there.
Thank you so much again to Emma and Soraya for your time, and thank you all for tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. If you would like to support Emma and the bookstore, click the link in the chat to purchase To Raise a Boy. We sincerely appreciate your support. Thank you so much, and have a great evening, everyone. Good night.
Bye.